So thank you so much, Megan. That was a great introduction. And I was unfamiliar with I guess, the customs. So it was really helpful, especially the last one where it said, like, we're not going to solve all the problems now, which is surprisingly relevant to what I'm going to talk about because I'm going to bring up a problem that I don't think can be solved at the end, but that I want people to think about. So the presentation is called Documenting Humanity, a critical perspective of asset-based research. And I like to start off presentations by doing acknowledgements of native land. Since this is the internet, I thought we could go pretty broad with this and talk about this website called landgrabu.org that has this amazing research about about all the ways Native American lands were sold to benefit land-grant universities in terms of the land they sit on, but also their funding for their original cohorts of classes. Since land-grant universities are such a large part of engineering education, a lot of the enrollment comes from land-grant universities, but also the research and just the overall culture of engineering education. A lot of it is coming from land-grant universities. I thought it was a great website to share. Also because I think what I'm trying to get at with this talk in terms of humanity is that, when we're looking to improve diversity, equity, inclusion, we can't just be doing it in the small space that we occupy. I guess, and that's the larger, I guess, question, that I'm going to leave y'all with is like, how do we get to this larger space? How do we get to an engineering education that recognizes where our funding comes from, and how that leads to problems with diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I'm going to try to do that by talking about asset models, which is a daunting task because how do we get to there? Like, why did I do a talk where I'm going to talk about asset models and try to get to talking about society? I asked y'all the poll briefly asked what your temperature was with respect to asset-based models in research. And it's good to see that it was, or I made this talk for people that were unfamiliar or new to the term. But I also, like, for people who weren't, I also, added this critical aspect to it because I know, like, that's how people engage in conversations, is getting them to think about these larger things. And so I wanted to go through, I wanted this talk to be for novices, but also people who are aware of this topic. About me, so I guess one of the reasons why I do the work I do is because like, I've always been interested in race due to my background. Yeah, I pass as white, but I'm Native American and I'm Latinante, and most people just see me as white, and or like when they meet me, that's what they think. And so that was always something that got me thinking about race. But more largely, in engineering education, I guess the reason I got into it was um, just because I didn't know why there were so many of one type of person, or in terms of identity. And like, so that means you have to go beyond just race and talk about class and gender and also disability. So that's what I've done. I identify as a proletariat in the capitalist system. So that's someone who only has their labor to contribute to the economic system. And that very much shapes the way that I do my research. And I have 2 degrees in mechanical engineering. And as Megan said, I have a PhD in engineering education from Purdue, which is a land-grant university. So it all ties in together. So just to briefly outline what I'm going to talk about, I'm trying to get it to align, again, all with people who are unfamiliar but also familiar. So we're going to start out by with unfamiliar or familiar with asset models. So we're going to start out by talking about asset models as discourse. Then we're going to go into a very important topic related to asset models, which is the deficit model, before we go back into defining what the asset model is. And depending on how much time we have, we might do the activity which kind of helps people formulate asset model language compared to deficit model language. And then concluding, I will talk about asset models as they relate to larger society. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions. I'll definitely stay on past the hour, but I know people have their other priorities, and I'm just so thankful that we had the people that showed up that did. And it's great to see some familiar names. I haven't gotten to talk to y'all in a while, and so it's great to see y'all. All right, so I'm framing asset models within this larger topic of discourse, and there's some positive and negatives of doing that. The reason I'm talking about asset models in terms of discourse, and discourse being just like the everyday words and conversations that we have and we're privy to that are going on around us, is that research very much is bounded by that discourse. And so it's good to just kind of think about it that way, in terms of the things that I get to research are very much limited by the society around me. And the society around me is ordered by white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. And like, as Bell Hooks defined, she likes to say imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And so that ordering of our society very much frames what we say. Oh, and that image, I guess, kind of illustrates, that's a statue on the Rice campus, and I felt like that's a good illustration of just like, if we can't control the things that are around us, there's a certain aesthetic to that statue that I can't control, and it's just there. And when I was at Purdue, it affected me. So that's kind of what I mean by discourse affecting research. It's something that can't be ignored. So, like I said, this talk's going to be about asset models, but first we have to talk about what a deficit model is. And basically, before getting too deeply into deficit models, it's good to just think about it within terms of discourse. So the things in our lives, the inequalities we see, there's a language set up to justify them. And so that's what I think, that's how I think about deficit models. So deficit models have occurred throughout history, or the way people talk have used deficit models throughout history. And the way deficit models are used is to justify the dehumanizing of people. Whereas asset models, I think, are ways of thinking about people, about their inherent humanity. And they're used because they're supposed to challenge that dehumanizing. We use asset models because we use asset model discourse because we want to see a better society that doesn't have the hierarchies that we have now. Just in terms of larger educational research, even though that I've created this dichotomy between deficit models and asset models, there's all sorts of other kinds of educational research that do not fall into either category. So just kind of to give you that perspective with the image on the slide. There was this really, really great presentation I got to see as part of the Juneteenth series of lectures at Rice. And one of them was about this publication by Frederick Hoffman in 1896. And as someone who is really interested in deficit model discourse, I really thought it was a great example of deficit model discourse, and just how unchanged our discourse has been for so long. And so I put a link up here for people. I don't know if you're going to make this public or the slides public, but so if they are, just go check it out. I thought it was great. One of the quotes in the presentation that I really liked, or that really stood out to me, so Frederick Hoffman, he submitted this 300-page research, let me go back a little bit, to justify why Black people shouldn't get life insurance from Prudential Insurance. And it was classified as research. one of the reasons why I really latched onto it was just how similar it is to uh, discourse from when I was a child, even up to discourse now. So I posted here a quote from Hillary Clinton in her famous super predator quote, um, because of how similar it was to Frederick Hoffman's quote. And basically they use the same tactic of boiling down people's humanity to these traits, and not considering people as people with friends and family and dreams, and how there should be some more consideration when considering how to best serve other people. So I'll read Frederick Hoffman's quote. "It is not the conditions of life, but in the race traits of and tendencies that we find the causes of excessive mortality. So long as immorality and vice are a habit of life of the vast majority of the colored population, the effect will be to increase the mortality by heredity transmission of weak constitutions." And then Hillary Clinton's quote, "They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel." And so, like, even though there's like important differences, like Hoffman cites eugenics, which was really popular back in the 19th century, there is kind of this common trait of, or the commonality of citing people's traits as something that's inherent to people, rather than thinking of people as people that are vastly affected by the social factors around them. And so getting into the meat of the deficit model, I guess this might be a good time before I do that to just stop and address any questions, because I know I've just gone through a lot.
So feel free to add your questions to the chat, or just turn your mic on and ask, or you can raise your hand in whatever order makes sense to you.
Let's see. Should I move on? Okay. All right. So I guess in terms of structuring this for all people, I guess it's first to be really helpful. It'd be really helpful just to define it right off the bat. So what is a deficit model? Here's a quote that I think is really good at explaining it, but it is still kind of jargony. So I'll deconstruct it a bit more after reading it. Within an educational context, an approach to so a deficit model is an approach to explain educational disparities that faults students' personhood, communities, backgrounds, and families, therefore assuming the solutions for improvement or reform are beyond the teachers and school systems' control and influence. And so I'll go a little bit further. So I guess the most basic, what that comment or what that quote is getting at, the most basic thing is this this little multiple choice thing question that I'm asking right here. What do you think that that is getting at in terms of this statement? Thinking about a social group in terms of what they blank. And I think Megan's going to put up a poll for that.
I didn't have this one as a poll.
Oh,
I only
okay.
made the other one.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. In the chat, put up A, B, C, or D. And let's see. Great. Looks like I'm getting mostly Ds. Yeah. So they all, A through C basically mean the same thing, but oftentimes I find that just putting like a blank isn't helpful either. So a deficit model is thinking about a social group in terms of what they lack. And and so oftentimes in literature, uh, I've come across ways of framing what people lack as a reason for why they're not as present in engineering education as another group. So literacy, professionalism, work ethic, attitude, preparation, knowledge, um, they are all cited in one way or another as like explaining, for instance, like underrepresentation in engineering. So deficit models always involve comparisons to a model social group. And sometimes the comparison is explicit, but what makes them so effective is that most of the time those comparisons aren't explicit. So in the quotes that I showed you by Hoffman and Clinton, those comparisons weren't explicit. So they're very much coded. And if you're not, if you're someone new to that type of discourse or uncritical of that discourse, it's very easy to think that, oh, I'm not the social group that's benefiting from this comparison, and that these are actually factual statements. And research by Bonilla Silva, I think, really frames how deficit models are effective, in that, like like I said, they pinpoint something about what people are lacking, and point people away from the larger society and how it functions for creating these disparities. And so, and that's called abstract liberalism. And I welcome anyone to read Bonilla Silva, because his research is just absolutely phenomenal in describing what abstract liberalism is. And then the final component of a deficit model is that the solution is always fixing the deficit at the individual level, so that that group resembles the model social group. So oftentimes solutions will be, so oftentimes solutions invoke respectability politics, which basically boils down to acting better. A good definition of respectability politics is the reform of individual behavior as a goal in itself and as a strategy for reform. So oftentimes that's learning a new skill, adopting a behavior, or fulfilling a standard at the individual level. One thing that's confusing about the deficit model is that there's other types of research that similarly talk about deficiencies, especially material deficiencies within a group in comparison to another group. But what a key difference, again, like I said in the last slide, what makes a deficit model, what completes a deficit model is that its solution is to fix the group, fix the group in question, whereas what I'm terming critical research is fixing the root cause. So there is a lot of important research that is going to talk about people's deficiencies, but they're doing it to fix a root cause, and that's an important difference. Great. So now we've gotten to a point where we're going to put this into practice. So like I've said, I'm thinking about deficit models in terms of discourse. So there's a lot of programming out there whose goal is to help with fixing underrepresentation, and they position their work in certain ways. And so so it's important to kind of be able to tease out, maybe this is a deficit model, like especially when you're choosing whether or not you want to work with a group. So the three things that I said earlier that define a deficit model, are that saying that a group is deficient, there's maybe an implicit, or that there's always an implicit comparison to another group, and that the solution is to fix the group that is deficient. I'd like you all to go into some breakout groups. They're going to be of size 3 to 5, and Megan's going to help with that. Thank you so much, Megan. And I want y'all to break down this, or yeah, deconstruct this quote I put up. I've given Megan the text, and so you should have access to it. And from those three components that I just described, see if you can spot them in this statement. And give everyone like 5 minutes. Right. So a reference to how people, how there's a group that's deficient, um, an implicit reference to implicit comparison to a group that's not deficient, and the solution being to fix the group that is deficient. I guess I can keep this up because everyone has the text. So.
So I think our group had said that, I'm sorry, should we raise hands?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. So I think our group had said that the fact that it's targeting schools that are lower served, that is kind of making an assumption. In the deficit model, we weren't sure if that's a bad or a good thing. You do want to target schools where they need. Oh, I'm sorry. So yeah.
Oh, I wasn't sure if you were asking a question. I think that's a great question, or if you wanted to continue.
Oh, that's it. I think we identified that as a deficit model, but then we were also kind of struggling with, is that actually a bad thing to?
Yeah. So that's actually why I made this little thing here, because that's one of the things that I found that people struggle with is that, so again, like it is not necessarily bad to cite a deficiency. It's more about how you want to rectify it. So it isn't necessarily bad that there might be an underserved school district or underserved schools in terms of like you citing it as a researcher. I'll go to the, but it's more in terms of the way you're framing your solution to it. So I think in this one, you know, I think I'll go to kind of what I found just to help illustrate what I'm talking about. So the deficit that's being cited is that there's this lack of interest. So igniting interest being like something, again, it's not necessarily something that's going to stand out to you. And so that's kind of what honing your skills in this is, why I'm doing this. Among at-risk youth. So that's the part where there's a comparison to a model group. So the at-risk right there, like, so there's a group that's not at risk. The great comment that was given, this reference to schools serving low to moderate income and minority youth, that's just a reality of life. Like, so, and again, it's citing a material inequity or inequality. And so that's, again, that's totally fine in terms of if you're a researcher, something in terms of like, in terms of ethics, but it's really how you're going to solve that. And so the curriculum is uniquely based around American and global STEM icons who the students can relate to. So yeah, I can see this being pretty tough, especially for someone, for people who haven't really done this before. So again, there's this idea of American and global STEM icons being like this, as having what is the right ideology to be in STEM. And it completely ignores what the students, the youth who are coming into the program might have themselves. And I feel like that's a good way to get into the asset model in a second. But yeah, like there's a general, so like this is kind of positioning a solution around people adopting a certain set of values that they don't have. And so that's why this kind of fulfills all the three components of a deficit model. And so before I go into this question, or I'm going to just go a little bit further, and then I'm going to ask y'all's thoughts on what I just said. So the major disadvantage of a deficit model is that you're not really doing good science anymore. You're really basing your findings off of how you perceive reality. And science is really about getting beyond our own perceptions and getting into things that aren't easily accessible. That's what we got our PhDs for, is to give us, or got into research or do the work that we do, is because we want to do these things that aren't that easy. And to me, it's kind of taking the easy road out when you're just basing your findings, or you're structuring your research around the things in society that are already confirming what you believe. So I've said a lot. This is the first part. This kind of concludes the first part. So any questions y'all that you want to share with the audience?
So I think that Patricia's comment in the chat is very interesting, and I think that it would be something interesting to talk about. And not to put Patricia on the spot, but I guess I did put you on the spot. But I think it's a great question or comment to discuss, because
Okay.
if, for example, the NSF is rewarding this type of language, I think that's something that we really need to talk about.
Oh, definitely. Okay, I'm just not seeing it in the chat.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. I don't know what happens to me when I try to multifunction. Or multitask.
Patricia, do you want to turn your mic on and share your comment?
Sure. Thanks, Bree. I'm just kidding. I was just saying that upon first read, like the language is so normalized in when I review NSF proposals or when I read project descriptions, that I was like, oh, like, yeah, like, so it took me a while to say, okay, to sort of think about the three things you mentioned. And to, anyway, so the short of it is that I feel like these terms like at risk and using model groups are normalized to the extent, and not only normalized, but they're valued. And so this is a sort of language that gets you funding in areas like broadening participation in CS and, like, you know, these large cross-directorate calls at NSF. And just that's, I don't know if I could, you know, sometimes when I write and I try to be specific, like when I don't say underrepresented minorities, but I say, you know, Black, Latinx, like everyone's like, oh no, push back. Like they don't want you to use such direct social justice, equity oriented language.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes, great question or great comment. This really gets to how I'm trying to connect to larger society. So like I was saying, discourse is very much framed by the people around us. And even within the NSF, there's competing discourses. So there's some programs. So I started doing, the reason I got into asset models was because my supervisor for my postdoc was doing a workshop for STEM, and she was tired of seeing deficit models in proposals. And so she told me that my job would be to give a keynote about this very topic. So these are very similar to the slides that I originally gave. And there were a lot of people who were not, this was the first time that they were thinking critically about that discourse. And so that's what's really hard about this work. And going back to what Megan said about problems that are not going to be solved by the end of this talk, the best I can do right now is kind of just bring that up. And you brought it up, which is great, is that these are sites of power. These discourses are the result of different types of power, or different people with different people with power in our society. And there isn't going to be, we're not equipped right now to, I cannot submit a grant knowing that if I submit something that's going to be seen as political, that my grant's not going to be defunded, or that it won't get looked at. But we go through that in all different sorts of ways. When we apply for jobs, when we say what our research interests are, that all comes up, and it's a big stressor in our lives that that I don't have a better solution to than just saying, like, we can support one another. That to me is right now like the only thing I have to say is like we have to support one another if we want to see less deficit models, or we want to be able to be better at recognizing them in our own work too. Okay. So this is a good time to then go into asset models. Let's see. Okay. So I've kind of set up this dichotomy. So if deficit models were about what people lacked, an asset model is about asset-based approach, or asset discourse is discourse that values strength, resilience, and assets. And I think one of the most important aspects of this type of discourse is that it challenges people's accepted notions. So for me, a big concept that I often rely on when I am doing my work is this notion of balance. And I got that because I grew up with, I had a mother who instilled that in me. And that's definitely something that has aided me throughout my work. And, you know, growing up in school, that was something that was rarely talked about. It was rarely something that I got to harness to get and get rewarded in the work that I produce. And so an asset-based approach to research is getting those sorts of, is research that looks into what the strengths that people have are and documents it, which is why I titled this presentation what I did. So, so if we were to kind of do the fill in the blank we did for the deficit model, an asset model is thinking about people in terms of what they, and then why don't you in the chat kind of fill in what this blank could be. Nice. Yes. Oh, I feel like such an effective teacher right now. All right, cool. Okay, yeah, so, oh, Patricia made another comment. Okay, let's see. Yeah, oh, okay, wow, okay, we'll talk about this hopefully in when I get to the end of this section. That's a great comment. Okay. So yes, so it is thinking about people in terms of what they have, and a big, a widely accepted framework for asset models is the YASO framework of community cultural wealth. I've also seen Mejia's Funds of Knowledge, which was published in the Journal of Engineering Education. So that one's pretty good in terms of if you're looking to learn what way of doing research in terms of asset model is. So I guess, yeah, the asset framework as a way of framing assets in terms of the YASO community cultural wealth model is to think of it's, oh man, this is where I'm like starting to get fuzzy, but there's 6 types of wealth that, or 6 types of capital that are identified in the wealth model, and aspirational, linguistic, familial, social, navigational, resistance. I can put in a PDF copy in the chat at the end of this, but yeah, just if you're looking to familiarize yourself more with a way of looking at people's assets, is a great resource. Asset model, okay, so with the deficit model emphasizes looking at people compared to another group, whereas the asset model emphasizes learning about the group as its own model population. And so when I was talking about the disadvantages of the deficit model, and this is a major advantage of the asset model, is that you're no longer, you're being forced to actually see a group in terms of its own humanity. What are the things within people that have allowed them to get to where they are? It's a very profound question, and it leads to really great research. Sometimes another group is referenced, but the goal of the research isn't to see who is better, see which group is better. And like I just talked about with the YASO model, critical theory is often employed. So critical race theory was used with was major part of developing the YASO model. Capital is a reference to Marx's Capital. You don't see it too often, but that's another example of critical theory that was used in that body of research. Asset model solutions place the necessity of change on the institution. So instead of focusing change on the individual, asset model solutions look at the solution as one that's the responsibility of the institution. The reason that this is really important is just like economically speaking, an institution has so much more labor that they can dedicate to a problem. And an institution is what's supposed to be serving us. Individual isn't supposed to be serving the institution, especially with disadvantaged groups. And because of that, it challenges the notions of respectability. When I turn the focus back to an institution instead of an individual, I'm inherently challenging respectability because I'm no longer putting the responsibility of change on an individual. Okay, so similar as to last time, I have, we're not going to do breakout groups again, but I've put up this blurb about from that I think really outlines what an asset model framework can look like. It's pretty short too, and so I'm just going to give y'all a couple minutes to read this, and then after that couple of minutes, I'll go into deconstructing it for a second, or for a couple minutes. So I'll just leave y'all to read this and make up your own minds in terms of what aspects of this are an asset model, and I guess from what I've talked about earlier, or just think of it in terms of how are people's strengths being focused on here? Is there a comparison to a model group here? And what kind of, this one's kind of hard and it might not even be there, but if you sense what kind of solution to like a problem like underrepresentation might be from this blurb. Cool, I saw another great comment, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about in terms of referencing, like having wording that that does cite a deficiency. So comparison is amount of resources in communities. I like foster girls' abilities. So even though it says to foster girls' abilities from under-resourced communities, it's not saying that it's not positioning the improvement in terms of a model group. And so yeah, it's definitely fine to point out deficiencies, but again, I guess that's part of what framing is like, how are you going to talk about it? And so I thought this really brought up some really great ways to do it. Under We Value, a lot of people made comments about the bullet points that were used. Yeah, so all these things kind of imply a solution that isn't focused around fixing people. And so, yeah, I thought that was great insight. So I'm really seeing people are catching on to this, so that's great. And yeah, so basically everything that was said in the chat is something that I pointed out here. Okay, so it's almost one. I pointed out what some of the main advantage of the asset model is, like it forces you to do good science. And what are limitations of the asset model in producing change within institutions? This goes back to a conversation or the comment that Patricia made in terms of, what happens when you have very limited power, and uh, that is, I guess, what I'm going to dedicate the rest of my time to talking about. But if you do need to go, then thank you so much for taking part so far. I'm going to skip over the activity because it's kind of time consuming, but I can go back to it after I get through this part, which is, I guess, goes back to Patricia's comment. So the asset model, if we're going to look at it critically, yes, it asks for changes within the institution, or yes, it promotes changes within the institution. When you're looking to promote people's strengths, you're, like I said, challenging respectability politics. You're saying that it's the institution's role to be a place where everyone can learn, everyone can work, everyone can contribute, and everyone can see their identities reflected in the work that is being done. But a lot of asset model work does not address the root cause of the problem. And that kind of, even though asset models aren't necessarily the most popular thing in the world, I think that's one of the reasons why they do get funded, is that you can still, as a researcher, meet institutional goals of funding your institution without having to challenge the overall power structure in your institution. And in that way, the institution can use what you do as good branding. Look at the way that we're furthering our institution, while at the same time, I guess what I was trying to do with this image right here, or this drawing right here, is kind of just show, like, your research is here in terms of the overall research of your. There's all these other inequitable things going on at your institution. And then on top of that, there's all these other inequitable things going on in society, and your research is really only able to touch on this little thing as it's constructed in asset model research. And while it's important to also bring up that, no, we can't solve all problems with our research, I think we can definitely go further. And so it's kind of important to think of our work as, well, for instance, like, the reason why I did the acknowledgement the way I did is, like, it is becoming more common for non-natives to give acknowledgements, which is great, but that also, like, it rests upon me, my responsibility to be like, okay, so now we're at this level, which is good. What about the thing that we're doing, why we're doing the acknowledgement, which is that we work in institutions who exist because of the genocide of Native Americans and the use of their land to fund those institutions. So, and so that's what I guess my overall goal with this talk was I feel like now that asset models are something that can be funded, it's also important to be critical of them. So, so a place that I like to start in terms of criticizing something is my place in them, and kind of recognizing why I'm not able to change things just by myself. Like I said, our research, or the research, is just a very small part of an institution, especially research on diversity. At a large research institution, most of the money is coming in for other things that might reinforce, or that do reinforce, inequity within the institution. And so it's very easy for your work to get compartmentalized within that. There's this kind of overriding philosophy that the work you do is going to somehow change the world, like you're going to publish it and it's going to get billions of views somehow, when that's just not how things work. Unfortunately, there's, like I was talking about, your work often is not going to be able to talk about the things that are creating the inequity in the first place. So I listed things like limited labor opportunities, racial wealth gap, rising cost of living, school to prison pipeline, lower wages. I mean, like, as someone, who's a bit younger in academia, it is really hard when none of the problems that young people are going through, especially young people of color are going through, are talked about in terms of diversity. You know, when you can't afford to pay rent and you're in grad school, how do you think you're going to do in your program? And these are not talked about even in our discussions about how we're improving diversity now. And so that kind of parallels with what Patricia said, like, you know, even within our own institutions, we're battling against discourse that counters our own, and it's very hard to deal with. And I don't have really great solutions other than we needed to start thinking about how to work with between ourselves. You know, and also the biggest limiting factor, I think, is, you know, and I'm doing this talk as a representative of myself and not of the university I'm part of. So I want to reiterate that, because I can be fired, and not all of us have tenure. A very few minority of us have tenure, and can use that to speak out against things. And so that's, you know, that's why it's really hard to change things. And, you know,
Connor, can I just get you to turn on your closed captioning? Keep talking, but just.
oh, no.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. I forgot about that. Okay. All right. And I guess, I think because I titled this talk about documenting humanity, I think that's something that, even though asset models are inherently about documenting humanity, unless they're able to go beyond and talk about larger issues that are creating inequity, I think that that's also kind of hiding humanity in itself. And so I guess, so just to close then, I found the parallel with asset models with respect to what's been going on recently. For me, I was in grad school when the University of Missouri hunger strike happened, and that had a huge impact on me into steering me into being more critical about what I did as a researcher. Primarily because, like, for me, it was the first time I had to really interrogate how discourse really shaped how people perceive social problems. And even though I was pretty sure of myself in terms of how I interpreted things, it was very difficult to encounter the types of discourse, a lot of deficit model discourse, for instance, that I had no control over, and I just had to deal with it. And so shortly after the hunger strike, Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri, and you saw the discourse of criminality being used to justify his murder. And so flash forward to today, and the murder of George Floyd. The murder of George Floyd similarly happened, but there was a much different response to it. And I'd like to parallel that with asset models in the sense of, yes, the response has been way more positive. The NFL, which had banned kneeling, now is going to permit players to do it in games if we ever have them again. Then you saw corporations such as Chevron give support for Black lives, even though they do a lot of work that really ruins Black communities in the U.S. as well as in Africa. Same thing with Walmart. Princeton just removed Woodrow Wilson's name from the policy school. And I guess as I question how much impact asset models have in terms of how they can be positioned as branding, that's the parallel I guess I saw, is that corporations can similarly can do a better job of actually citing of messaging in terms of how they interpret things like police brutality, but they can also continue doing whatever inequitable practices and I don't really like inequitable practices sometimes because like it's jargony, but it's just like things that ruin people's lives, you know, and so, and I guess that to me is the problem I'm trying to encounter with this, with trying to be critical about asset models is, how do we make our work, how do we make asset models more than just branding? And for me, it means that we're going to, like, if you're looking to get into this work, or you are into this work, how do we start talking about these things that are, you know, outside of where we are? And again, I don't have a really great solution, but for me, that's what it is. But I also leave that question for everyone else, you know, to kind of think about. But now, yeah, we can talk about that now, or any other question you have. So thank you.
Konik, I want to bring your attention to a couple of questions and comments in the chat. So one of the questions was from, I think it's Joe, are you still here? So he was saying, in engineering, I also find our coursework generally follows a deficit model, FE exam standards, etc. I'm interested to hear how others might have applied asset-based models in the classroom while still appeasing accreditation. So that's one discussion topic. And then sort of building on that is, can team, from Sue Wainscott, can team design projects get at asset models, perspective of others, assets of team members?
Yeah, great. So there's teaching practices that we can employ. There's some things, like I was just saying, that we can't change unless we work together to change them. So, you know, unless we work together to change what an FE exam is, or if they should even exist, or how we evaluate engineers after they graduate, that's something we're gonna have to do together. But I guess within teaching practices, I think one thing that we can do, and is something that I'm doing right now, which is treating knowledge as a conversation. So yes, engineering has been, there's a lot of engineering that is, you know, put an answer in a box, and that answer needs to be exactly like the answer that the teacher has. But there's definitely ways to get around that in terms of thinking about engineering as a thought process, and putting the rigor of teaching that thought process on instructors. So again, so flipping it around as from a problem of the individual to a problem of the instructor. So how am I as an instructor teaching the process that needs to go into engineering, and having students then evaluate me, asking where they have their questions, asking what have I explained well. And there's other things, culturally relevant curriculum. Something I like to do is explain like machines as like characters, or the components of machines as characters, and within a story. Though that kind of gets around the deficit model in terms of, now you are starting to look at students around you as people, and like and going back to what I was saying, like, how are they interpreting that story? They can start engaging in knowledge that way, in terms of like, does this story make sense? Am I telling a good story? And then again, it's more about me and what I'm doing to teach them, and not about are they able to get through this confusing material that I might not be teaching very well. With design projects, so again, there's kind of this dual level to asset models. I think like for the easy part with asset models in terms of design projects is, you know, realizing that, again, there's these societal issues that affect students. So for instance, like we kind of think, we kind of structure work around, okay, a common way of doing it is like divide and conquer. Well, that really puts in, that really allows for deficit model things, because like, oh, this group member didn't contribute as much as this other group member. So, you know, now that we've had to go through work, what work is like, and now in the post-COVID world, you know, we have to be much more honest about how we want to socialize work behaviors within students, and realizing that we can't allow students to have these assumptions that, oh, such and such is going to be able to perfectly do this, And then if they don't, they're going to get marked down by the group or whatever. We need to start being a lot more sensitive about those types of things, and teaching that sensitivity in terms of that being the final goal rather than, kind of allowing for these deficit model type things to come through. So there's a lot more I can get into. I see some more questions. Okay, I can do the activity that I didn't. Okay, Tasha just asked a question.
Oh, that's not a question. I'm more bouncing off of something else in the chat.
Oh, okay. Do you want to talk about that?
It was, well, Megan had put a question about, or a comment around the language giving people what they need to succeed, and how that could be a deficit perspective, I guess, depending on how you view that. And so I was suggesting maybe, because I when I hear that, I'm thinking about it more as we're providing assistance in more equitable ways. So we're acknowledging that some different people just need different kinds of assistance. And so we need to be agile to be able to give different communities what they need to succeed. But if it's, oh, there's that stupid person who can't do anything, oh, let me help them, then yeah, that's a deficit perspective. So I was just trying to rethink how to think about that, I guess.
Yeah, so when you had the little picture of I think in the definition of the deficit model, where it assumes that everyone's starting at the same place, and that's the whole point of equity, is recognizing that it's not a level playing field and we're not starting from the same place. But in my work, like the organization I work with, our official definition is equity is giving students what they need to succeed. But that language in and of itself is somehow now triggering me to think like that sounds like a deficit model, because it's not looking at the institution, it's looking at the individuals. And so I don't know, it's just giving me big pause to think about the language I use and how I write and teach, to make sure that I'm using that true asset framework.
Yeah. I try to, sometimes I fall into the idea that I need to do things a certain way. Like this presentation, I was really worried about it because I was like, what if everyone already knows all this stuff and already made this presentation? And, Megan talked to me about this, and she really did a great job of just being like, well, you volunteered to do this because, you thought you had something to offer. So, it really helped me. And so it is daunting to, talk to people that have done, do this professionally. And, I hope that, you found what I said useful, but also that what I also said wasn't very depressing. So I hope I navigated that well.
You certainly did, Connie. One of the things I think about is it's truly a mindset, right? And how we're taught to think and socialized to think, and how much of it is truly rewiring those neural pathways in our approach to things. So because my life is centered in my whiteness and my upbringing in a certain way, because I was raised in a very individualistic culture, it takes a lot of work for me to like pivot and to see like how I need to look the other way and to not have that kind of deficit perspective. And it's a journey. It's a journey that we're all on, and we're trying to figure out, and we're trying to improve. And so the sort of hopeful piece of this is recognizing that this isn't a switch. You can't just turn it on and like all of a sudden you've got it. It's an increased awareness of like, oh wow, that language I just used doesn't fit this model that I want to follow. And so that's the sort of hopeful piece to me.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Connick, for all that you offered us today. I think that we've all learned so much. And so for those of you who are still on the line, I will polish the recording of this. I have to admit, I have a backlog of 3 sessions I need to manage the recordings, but I'll get this one posted soon. And so you'll be able to come back and access it. And so whatever resources Connick's willing to share with us to post, I'll also put those back on the CDEI website to save for posterity. And again, we're so grateful for your participation. We appreciate your time. And so next week, we've got another great session lined up. I think next week we're talking about, oh my gosh, I just forgot. It's serving students in this sort of online presence and taking care of their well-being. Hopefully I'm right on that one. If not, that'll be the next week. But we're grateful for your time. And as we're starting to gear up for this next school year, if you have sessions that you'd like to teach, right? You know, you don't have to be like the premier expert. If you have skills, if you have knowledge that you want to share with this community, we welcome you and invite you to submit that to us, and so that we can continue these conversations. And so, Kanik, I don't know if you can see the chat, but you're getting lots of thank yous and
Yes,
comments.
thank you so much. I really appreciate the great feedback, and you added stuff that are the kinds of thoughts that were brought up were definitely things that I'm really glad I got to do. This was the reason why I wanted to do a talk like this, was to hear what y'all were thinking. So thank you so much.